people wanted to have better visuals showing what was being described in the original interview. So this time we will attempt to provide that. In the last video, I fairly randomly selected a small handful of images so as to have at least something visually related to Rob's YouTube channel to put in the video. But it could have caused some confusion as far as how it related to what was actually being discussed during the interview. So we will go ahead and begin. Hopefully you will see imagery on my screen, and Rob has the same ordered line of imagery on his interview. We'll conduct the interview by just allowing Rob to go through the images and describe what's being viewed, and I'll make the occasional remark, commentary, or pose any questions.
Okay, Rex, in the last interview, the first thing that I kind of remember speaking about was what I called a Sasquatch village. Now, this was a group of structures that appeared suddenly near a campground right around June 1 of 2018, and on June 1 they weren't visible, they weren't there, and on June 30th this entire village had been constructed. And so what we've done here is I've actually got pictures of what the village shows. The first image here is what I consider the central or the main structure of the village, and the title says largest structure in a central location. And what this is that you can see it's kind of a debris-type hut with areas for 3 large individuals to sleep. Now, you can't see it real well, but in the portion of the structure that's faced, you can see there's grass under there, and it's matted down where something has been laying on this grass under the front part of the village. Now, the next image down is the same structure from a little different angle, showing more the long, almost C-shaped outside perimeter of the structure. And you can see here that also there's a cavity underneath that section where there were some large individuals sleeping. The third one down is just kind of the exterior, and you can see where there's a tunnel or a gateway going in from the outside of this structure. Now, as I looked at this, I figured there were probably 3 adults and probably a few juveniles that were using this as a sleeping or a bedding area. Now, why do I think this is not made by humans? Well, primarily because very few, there were a few, but very few of these sticks were actually cut. Almost every one of them was hand broken, and they weren't cut with a saw or cut with an axe. They were just snapped. And the second thing, Sasquatches have a very peculiar way of building things that humans just don't do. And what they do is they will force a couple of sticks or poles together, but use the weight or the natural bend in one pole to hold in place or to hold up another pole. And that's very characteristic of what I see on what I consider Sasquatch structures. And in almost no case, in fact, I can't think of a case where I've ever seen that in what I consider a human-built structure. The human-built structures basically are usually poles. Almost in every case, they've been sawed or cut, equal length, very often similar diameter. Usually the branches have been stripped away, and they're either just laid up next to each other or they're tied off with some cordage. Now, once there's cordage, I personally don't think that Sasquatches really understand cordage. I think if there's some cordage or some knots in there, probably humans have gone in there and done some messing around, but I can't prove that. But this group of structures in particular, I don't think there was one knot in any of these structures holding anything in place. Okay? There might be, but I don't remember seeing one. Now we're going to go down to the next photo, the 4th photo. This is a separate, very small structure, and it was right next to that large structure we were just looking at above, probably 15 feet kind of directly in front of it on the ground. And I view this as some structure that some juvenile had built of which to lay in. It's way too small even for a 12-year-old scout-aged boy. It would have to be, in human terms, probably a 7 or 8-year-old could crawl in there, but I don't think anyone any bigger than that could have crawled into this. Okay.
I just want to interject really quickly that what I've seen is that often Sasquatch will have these kind of ingenious interlocking, almost jigsaw-type puzzle structures. It's not the typical way, like you're saying, a human would do it. You'll have a Y, that branch that's interlocked with another Y, and really haphazard, but it's ingenious in its own way.
Well, and what it does is it links the pieces together without having to rely on or anticipating relying on tying cordage or using cordage to help these stay together. I mean, they're specifically engineered and designed so that you don't need cordage in order to do them, which in my opinion is much more work than just bringing some cordage in and building it the way a human would. Okay? But anyway, be that as it may. Now, the next structure down, this is a entirely different structure. This would have been about 50 yards to the north of that center structure. And in fact, the center structure is directly behind this, but you can't see it because of this little lean-to type structure. Now, I figured this was more of kind of like a guard station. Someone would have been in this acting as a lookout for whoever was staying in the center structure. That, in my opinion, would have been the family, would have been the females with the youngsters. This would have been probably an older juvenile or an adult male would have been here, staying here, to act as the lookout or kind of the last line of defense before people got to the main center structure where the juveniles would be. The next picture down is the same structure from the opposite side. And you can see it's not anywhere near as much time was taken in building this. It was kind of thrown together and really not anything that I would imagine a person would make. Again, no twine or nothing tying it together. But it really wouldn't offer any windbreak, and it wouldn't offer any shelter from moisture. These just weren't dense enough to do any of that. So I don't understand why a human would possibly make it. Now, we'll scroll down to the next picture, and this is part 2 Sasquatch Village up in the upper left-hand corner. This is the floor or the bottom of this little lean-to thing that we're looking at. And you can see how the leaves, that's skunk cabbage leaves that are kind of pounded or been laid on and flattened out there. So something's definitely been laying or sitting under this lean-to. You could say it's a person, but I don't think that's what it was because there's not enough cushioning or that in that little bit of grass to do a person any good. I think a Sasquatch would have done that just simply so they're not having to sit in the mud or in the dirt. Okay, but there's no cushioning, no thermal properties expected from it. Okay, we'll scroll down to the next photo. Now, this was going back over near the main structure in the village. And these were just sticks that were laid out on the ground. My feeling with these things, after seeing similar things in many cases, is the Sasquatch has probably just laid sticks out like this to sit on them. Again, just to stay out of the dirt. Okay? Rather than build chairs or whatever else, they would just sit on these things. But again, these are my opinions, and I don't claim to be an expert on them, but I have looked at a lot of this stuff, seen a lot of it, and that seems to make sense to me.
And on this particular image, I just want to mention those elephant ear type plants are always in the wettest areas, so I would assume certain times of the year that would be almost mucky, where sticks might be advantageous to get a little higher up off that.
Yeah, this was kind of a flat meadow where this structure was located. And though it didn't stay wet all year round, particularly early in the year, it would have been a little moister, a little marshier, and snow would have lingered here a little longer because there were some tall trees around that would have offered a little bit of shelter. So that makes sense. This would have not been as dry as some of the south-facing hillsides where they would have dried out much sooner. Now, the next picture down, this is just a simple little structure, again, right next to or adjacent to the center structure. Now, what this is, who knows what this is? What is it, the beginnings of another sort of lean-to that was kind of started, never completed? I don't know what to say, or is it just some Sasquatch needed something to do? But you can see how the frame poles are kind of intertwined in a triangle there, one over another, which you see so often in these structures, and that's why I want to include this in the photograph, is to show that kind of framework that you see so many times.
Yeah, on that one, I can clearly see the sticks laid across that triangle area, which to me makes it so it's not natural. Somebody just glancing at that for a second might think that's all natural, but with that type of arrangement, I wouldn't say normally just happens by nature.
Yeah, just by the sticks laid across there, that somebody or something did this, okay? This didn't just happen. Now, the next one down, this is an additional lean-to. This is due what would be south of the main structure by about 75 yards. And this is going further from the campground because, remember, we're not too far from a campground. This entire structure is about 200 yards from a main campground. And this is in the south end, away from the campground. And this is a tall lean-to, a tree pushed over, with a lot of taller branches or poles lined up on both sides. And this is tall enough that something pretty tall could have stood up underneath this. I'm 6'3", and I easily fit in here. Something 7.5 feet tall could have stood up there in the center of that. That's how tall this was. Again, my feeling is this is kind of a lookout area where probably the adult male of the area would have been to kind of watch the thing and look for people coming in the area. But again, that's my opinion. Who knows? Now we scroll down, and this is the same structure from an opposite view, showing it. I'm now on the south side of this, looking back towards the north. The center structure is further beyond this by about 75 to 100 yards, but you can't quite see it out there because of the brush and that in between. Okay. Now the next photo down, this is a structure that predates the Bigfoot village. This is about 200 yards to the north, closer to the campground. And this is a structure that had been built the summer before, or the first time I saw it would have been the summer of 2017. And this is just a classic lean-to sort of thing. Now, the reason I say, again, this is probably Sasquatch and not people-built is, number one, there's no twine anywhere in this. And 95% of all those branches or poles or sticks leaning over the main branch are all broken. And there are a few that were cut in here, but not too many. If I remember, I only saw one or two that had been sawed or had been chopped. And the others appear that they've just been broken off and put into here. The other thing that's kind of interesting with this, which I see in these wigwam sort of structures like this, is at the far end, where it gets down low towards the ground, it always appears that they leave that open, or at least a peek out point where they can look out that far end of these things. And I've seen this in this, not only this structure here, but in many, many others. But this kind of predates the rest of the village. And I believe, Rex, you saw this. Is that correct? You saw this structure.
Right.
Do you remember?
Yeah, I do. I've seen this probably 2 or 3 times, and I know there's this one a lot of Sasquatchers are familiar with, and they've featured it in their videos more so than some other ones because it's been there a while. One other thing I'll mention briefly, there's another, at least to me, indication that this could be Sasquatches. It seems like they always put larger supplemental branches that aren't really something a human would do. It just kind of there, for instance, to see the large one in front on this one, just kind of hanging up there higher, and then behind it there's some more branches that are just kind of randomly laid back in the tree trunks there, just kind of surrounding the area. And that seems to commonly be the case with these type of structures, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I agree, and I've talked to a lot of people about that. It seems that in many of these structures that we find, there are just kind of inexplicable things from a human mind that are incorporated in the structures. A person's going to be pretty practical and not put anything in there that they don't really need or want, and spend a lot of time with some really large or heavy object or pole or something and put it in one of these things. But these Sasquatches, that doesn't seem to enter into their thinking. And this is just one of many times where some oddball thing is put in there, and who knows why. I have no idea, or if there is a thought process, or just, it just happened to be laying down and they just put it in. I can't really say. Okay.
Yeah, our idea of embellishment or decoration is not really that. I'm wondering sometimes if that's their idea. That I don't know, but anyway, just a thought.
Yeah, who knows? Since we don't really know how they think, we don't really know the behind that. What the reasoning is. Now, the next picture down, this is another framework of a structure that's right near the one just above this. And this has been there also a very long time, but a lot of people didn't tend to notice. It's up the hill from that structure. But you can see it's the same sort of thing. You've got these poles that are intertwined, one going over, under another. And if you really follow these poles around, you're going to see that in many cases here. I feel this was probably a lean-to sort of structure that had a lot of boughs or brush on it at some point. And I'm guessing they kind of abandoned it and took the brush somewhere else and, finished it off. Or maybe they just started building this and never finished it. I don't know what to say. But this did not fall there. Somebody or something built this, okay? You can't not intertwine those branches and poles like that. They don't just fall that way. Trees start falling down. But I thought this was pretty fascinating.
That one to me looks so precariously arranged in this particular photo. I'm assuming it might have been different at one time, like you're saying, but yeah, it seems almost like it shouldn't be standing. It's like it's a miracle just standing up. But anyway, just my perception on the photo there.
No, I see that a lot. They'll have something bent, even though it's above it and it goes down below something, another branch, the pressure of that bend will hold things up or hold things in place many times that doesn't seem like it should. Also, the other thing you've seen, I know you've seen it, Rex, is that you'll see a tree that looks kind of like it's just suspended in the air. Well, when you look at it, what they've done is they've wedged it in between two other trees so that it's held really tightly because it's just bound between two green growing trees, and it's held in place because it's so tightly wedged. It couldn't have fallen in and got that tightly wedged. You know, it had to be just jammed in there for that sort of thing to happen.
Yeah, I've seen things that are slightly bent to where they have to bend it to fit in there, and if it were straight on, then it would be a loose fit, but they had to bend it in there, and it's tight as can be, so yeah.
What this is here, this is a screen. Now, if I remember, there were 4 or 5 of these built around the extreme periphery of the Sasquatch village. This one was on the far south, further south in that tall teepee that we just looked at just a few moments ago. And this one is really interesting to me. First of all, you've got a stick parallel to the ground, and in all these cases, it's wedged between two existing trees and very tightly wedged. So it's not just loosely sitting in there. It's really shoved in there tightly. And then there were some sticks or small poles lined up, and you can see they're lined up here. I had seen this structure a couple times, and a few times there are a lot more poles than other times. You know, I don't know if that's people or how they disappeared. This one is really interesting to me because there is a grass mat, or there's grass on the bottom of the structure that obviously a Sasquatch had been laying on. Again, I think to keep it out of the mud. Now, the reason I'm so interested in this grass matting like this, in that Albert Ostman, it's a well-known story in Bigfoot lore, was the Canadian miner that was looking, or I guess I should call him, he's looking for a gold mine up on off of Vancouver Island. And he was grabbed by a Sasquatch, stuffed in a bag, and hauled off after about an all-night long walk, and lived with the Sasquatches for about 3 or 4 days. And he references how the place that they were sleeping had kind of a mat laying down, and he thought that it was woven grass or whatever else, and made into a blanket. Well, I've seen this several times, and this is actually the third one of these where we've seen this sort of thing. Though this isn't tied or woven together, it's laid there, and it may be how he remembered it. He may have remembered it actually as a blanket where it was just grasses that were laid down and then had been laid upon. But anyway, that's why I find that really interesting.
I think if I remember right, that's the story. Isn't that the story where he offers the elder Sasquatch some chewing tobacco and then he finally makes his escape at that point? Is that the same story?
Yes, that's the same story. Yeah. And the old man, as he called him, takes the whole little packet of snuff. I guess that's chewing tobacco with more kick, I guess. And takes it all and almost poisons himself, and he was able to run away while the Sasquatch was gagging and trying to recover.
Yep.
Now, this next photo down is the same structure, a little different angle showing the matting again. Okay, and again, remember, this is south, and it's at the base of what starts up a hill, but this is the furthest from the campground. So we're about 300 yards now from the campground, and we're going the opposite direction from the campground, is where this lookout is out looking out on the woods away from the campground. Now, the fourth structure here, this was tough. It was getting dark here, and this was another screen, but this is over near the campground. So now we turn around and we go back about 300 yards the other way, and here was a screen, and this was probably 50 yards from the campground. And though this doesn't look like too much in and of itself, and I normally wouldn't have thought too much of it other than the fact that there was another screen right near it. And we'll scroll down to that other screen here now. Well, hold it. No, it looks like I didn't include that other screen. Well, I'm sorry about that. There's another screen that looks a lot like the one on the north side of the campground, right next to this. Now, I guess one of the points I want to make here, if any one of these things you found out in the woods by itself and hadn't seen another, I would think it would be very reasonable to expect that it was made by a human, okay? But the fact that this village suddenly appears and disappears, and the fact that it's in an area where within an area 5 or 10 miles, there must be another 30, 40, 50 structures similar to these, but different, all over the area. And the structures are being made, they're being taken down, they're disappearing. A new structure comes in, it's disappearing. These things are being made all the time. And the fact is that no one ever sees anybody make them. And the reason I know that is because I've gotten to know all the camp hosts and the Forest Service personnel that work in this particular canyon. And I've talked to them about them. I've walked with them to these structures, and they tell me, and in many cases, they've told me about the structures and directed me there so that I could go up and look at them. They're the ones that found them. And they tell me, hey, these things just suddenly appeared overnight, and we didn't see anybody build them, and nobody saw anybody build these things. It's just too coincidental. You know?
What human builds a structure only at night? It's the most inconvenient time possible. Unless you're military operation, you're forced to do something like that. Nobody's going to do that.
Yeah, and there aren't any military operations in public campground. That's just not going on.
Yep.
Now, we'll scroll down to the next one, and this is a debris hut, and you actually showed this in the last video. This is about a half a mile to the north of the Sasquatch village. And this is an entire hut made out of, with a center pole and then poles lined up against it and then boughs put over it. Now, this is a structure, it's quite a ways away from the other things. It's made in classic survival type debris hut, which if you read some of these books on survival, they talk about how to make these things, and this is kind of classically made there.
This one has a little more. Oh, sorry. I would say this one has a little more padding, if I remember right, than the other one, so it might actually keep a little heat in. Is that accurate?
That's right. Okay. I think it was. I'm going to scroll down to the next photo down, show it from a different angle. This, though, I think was probably Sasquatch made again because nobody there in the campground, the camp host, never saw anybody build this thing. And this took quite a bit of work. But there are a number of cut poles in this structure. I'm going down to the third one down, which is another view. And then I'll go to the fourth one here. And this is the one that you showed in the previous video. And you can see a number of those appear to be tips of trees that have been cut. There's about 6 or 7 that have been cut here with a saw. Now, these are in a campground, and so there was a lot of cut timber. So it would have been handy, and that's why a Sasquatch would have done it. But if someone was going to argue with me and say, well, I think this was human-made, I couldn't really disagree with that on this particular structure because, again, if this was the only thing in the whole area, I'd say, yeah, that's probably the case here. But in light of the fact that there's so many other things going on, I tend to doubt that, okay? But be that as it may. And have you ever seen this structure?
Yeah, I've seen this one a couple times. I guess this one was a toss-up, like you're saying, taking everything else into account. Who knows the origin, but this one, more likely than any others as far as design, it could be human, but we just don't know for sure.
Sure. Now, as I continue to walk around the lake, this was on the complete opposite side of the lake, and the reason I included this photograph is just because this is really odd. Now, I have seen and I was taught in Scouts that when you're marking trails, you might build a little rock stack, 2 or 3 high, rocks 2 high with a rock on one side meant you went in one direction. I mean, there were little codes that you could leave when you were out walking in the woods. This apparently was the remains of what had been a much taller pile of rocks at some point, and I just saw it at this level. And I think you knew a little more about this than I do, don't you, Rex?
Yes, if it's the same one I'm thinking of, it was taller at some point. It seemed to be, again, almost like a magician put it together. It was so tall, and everything was just so to where, if you touched it, you're afraid it would fall over, but it was freestanding. It was pretty impressive if it's the one I'm thinking of.
Yeah, and so the only reason I've got this again is it's just odd. It's something that people aren't doing out in the woods. Now, let me preface this a little bit. I think I mentioned in the previous video, people say, well, Boy Scouts are doing this. Well, look, when I was a kid, I was a Boy Scout psychopath. I mean, I was an Eagle Scout. I was part of the Order of the Arrow. I got several palms on my eagle, which means I really was into scouting and stayed in scouting for a long time. And I can tell you this sort of stuff was never done by scouts. I mean, they just didn't do this. We wouldn't go and cut boughs off of trees when we were in scouting because they didn't want you desecrating the forest. Though they would talk about how to do it, they would never actually practice it. Little stone path markers were made, but never structures, towers out of stones. That just didn't happen. And there's a huge amount of work that goes into this stuff. And that's the biggest part of it, is that the amount of labor that goes involved, for example, making that Sasquatch village. First of all, it's not serving a person any practical purpose. And second, to spend all that time just to spend time, hey, I'd rather go fishing, and I think most people would. But
yeah, and I'll just add, I also was an Eagle Scout. There's no merit badge for rock stacking. The only time I ever remember clearing out debris is one time from an Eagle Scout project. We helped clear some trails and make them more passable. Like you're saying, we didn't build any debris huts. We just had tents, that type of thing.
Yeah, and I remember we used to hike into areas and the kids were all interested in going fishing. That's what they were going up there for. They weren't going to go build structures. They were going to go try to catch some fish. So anyway, that's how I remember my scouting.
Yeah,
now the next picture
for firewood, and sorry, good.
Yeah. Now the next picture down, this is one that's also is fairly well known. I did not find this structure originally. I saw it on a video, and I know there's been several researchers that have seen it. But I wanted to include this because this is about a mile to the south of the Sasquatch village, but it's over a mountain. I mean, the hill goes up a couple of thousand feet and then come down. And this is actually right near the road, but there's a river between this structure and the road, and not many people cross the river because there's not many places that look like there's really anything on the other side of the river to cross to. But some fellows found this, and this is, in my opinion, unbelievably fascinating, in that there is not one piece of twine in this entire structure. Now, granted, there are probably half a dozen or more of these poles that have been cut, or chopped with an axe. But in my thought process, the most incredibly compelling thing about this structure, you can see that large center pole in the middle there. That's basically the support for the whole structure. If that pole goes down, the whole structure falls. That is just basically been kind of like broken on both ends. I mean, almost like chewed or not. It's just very odd. It hasn't been cut with a saw. I didn't see any axe chipping on it. And it's setting on the ground. It's not dug into the ground. It's setting on the ground. And then you've got logs across the top that are set on top of it that literally, with the right kind of push, could push the whole thing over. I do not see any way in the world a human would put this kind of weight on such a precarious center support. And this would have to have been done by, this is not some kids. This has to be done with adults. You've got logs in here, a number of them that are probably well over 300 to 400 pounds. A tremendous amount of work would have gone into this. And this thing is really big. It's probably at the widest point, maybe 30 feet wide and 40 to 45 feet long. You could have slept 30 adult males in here. Yeah, I mean, granted, they'd be real cozy, but this is really, really big.
You can't quite get the scale from just the little photo there, but and like you're saying, the main support, you can't see the top of it, obviously, but it's kind of pointed and there's this little shelf, but somehow they managed to get all the weight you look at it is bearing on that thing, and it's just amazing it doesn't fall down, but it's really fascinating.
A human would not have engineered this. A human would not have taken that kind of risk, because you'd have had to have an army of men building it and would have put a real support on here. Now, on the other side of this, just on the outside of this, there's obviously a campfire that was made by humans. You have a ring of telephone-type poles. They're not quite that long, but big logs, and they're on top of tent stakes. Some tent stakes have been crossed in the ground, and then you have a center 50-gallon oil barrel that's been cut in half and used as a fireplace in the middle there. So on the exterior of this, clearly some people have built that, and that would have been done by humans. But this structure itself, nobody can convince me that people would have ever done this. And I don't know that people really could have done it. You know what I mean? Would have engineered this and gone to this kind of effort. I mean, this is a huge undertaking. Anyway, now I've got another view of it.
Beyond the scope of what humans could normally do or would do.
Yeah. Now this is the view from the roadside, and you can see what they had done is they packed this side with boughs that basically blend this into the hillside. You can see this from the road, but you can't see it because it's camouflage like this. So I would say maybe 1 in 10,000 people that drive up this road ever notice anything is there, okay? And the only ones that probably really do notice it are people that have walked over here and seen this to begin with, and so they know that it's there to begin with. But just to spot it going up the road from the other side, Now, this same spot, just right up on the hillside, because the hillside is really steep as we go away from the creek and the road here, it gets very steep. There's a well-known video about a Sasquatch in Payson Canyon, and that Sasquatch is up on the hillside, and that hillside is within a couple of 100 yards of where this structure is. And you can probably find that online.
Yeah, that's a fairly well-known one. I think if you just Google Payson Canyon Sasquatch, that's the one that, or Bigfoot, that's one that comes up.
All right, now the next one we've got down here, it actually is the same structure again, just from a different angle, showing you the inside. Now I'm on the south end of it, looking up through the north, and this is more looking to the inside of it. I've been inside of it, but believe me, that center pole is precarious enough. I wouldn't want to spend a lot of time in there because, in fact, this may already be down. It may have fallen this winter. I'm expecting this thing to fall down at any time. And I don't know if it survived the winter or not. I haven't been able to get in there to see it yet.
One other quick comment. See the long branch, the tree trunk that's coming way out there to the right? They started laying a whole bunch of little bitty sticks going all the way to the end from maybe 3 feet high all the way down to like half a foot. And so that was a weird addition. Maybe that's what I see here on the other side, but I think they did it also on this side.
Yeah,
I don't see it here, but anyway.
I know what you're talking about, and I have some photos of it, but I didn't include them here. But I tend to think when they line those sticks, my feeling, again, this is my opinion, so it's worth what you're paying for it. I feel that they use that as somewhat of a screen where these creatures will lay behind them and they use it to break up their outline, and they use it as kind of an area where they can look out and watch for things. I'm guessing that's why they do that. Again, I really don't know, but maybe just for decoration. Who knows? Now, the next one we're going to come to, this is, maybe, 7, 8, 10 miles away from that structure. This is an entirely different structure, made entirely different than any of the ones we've just looked at. And this is more of what I would call a log cabin sort of structure, in that it's made almost like a cabin, and that you've got logs piled on top of each other. But as you look at this, it looks somewhere between being piled on top of each other and just being thrown together in a big mass. Extremely chaotic and not very well organized structure at all. And I'll just kind of scroll around it. The first one, the second one here is one side. You can see this looks a little bit like a cabin if these logs are laid on top of each other here. Okay. There's a little bit of what we would call a roof area on part of it. Again, you've got logs laid on top of each other and then some crisscrossed in between. You can see those on the left side, kind of the way you would imagine a log cabin to be made. One log laid on top of another on top of another. Okay. And then the other thing to notice, there's some rocks here on the roof. Frequently see rocks on the roofs on some of these things, or on the upper part. I don't know if it's to hold them down or if there's another reason for that or not, but you see that fairly frequently. And then this is I'm looking now from the south back up to the north. It's not exactly rectangular, it's a little oddball shape, so it's a little trickier to get around it than you would think. But you can also see how you've got the one section where you have a bunch of poles or sticks that rather than be on top of each other, they're piled vertically. Again, what's the reason for that? Well, is it possible that that's where the watcher, the creature that was assigned to look out for everybody else, Is that where they stayed? I don't really know what to say about that, or maybe that was just the easiest, quickest way to build that portion. I don't know what to say.
And if I remember right, didn't the camp host say that this little upright structure was a later addition? I don't know how much time passed in between the two, but I think that one was...
Yeah, the camp host, which we both met, when the structure was first made, just the center portion was there, and this exterior portion with the vertical sticks sticking up in the air was added maybe a year or two after that. You know what I mean? Or suddenly appeared, is how he described it. Now, we'll scroll down to the next picture, and this is kind of a view of the inside, and what you can kind of see is the chaos on the inside. A human would want to build something to kind of have a nice place to get cozy and get kind of warm. This structure was not built so that you could really accommodate a roof. There weren't walls that are the same level. They're not square to each other. There's just a whole bunch of things, and they're just not designed that way. At least over the whole structure, you did see one place where some had been piled up. But the rest of it is really not designed to accommodate a roof. And a person, I can't imagine, would go to this effort to build a structure that wasn't going to keep them dry from wet and from snow. So I don't know that a person would build this, because why would he build it? Okay. Why would a Sasquatch build it? Well, I'm guessing that maybe because they're heavy body fur, that the wet doesn't bother them as much as the windbreak. And they're building it more to be a windbreak for themselves than to keep the snow or the rain off of them. But that's, again, my opinion. I don't know if that's right or not. Now, we'll scroll down to the next one. This is another view of the north end. And you can see this huge tree that's laid across the top. Here's another thing that people just wouldn't do. You've got all different size of logs in here, but then you have this one tree that's got to be a 2,000 or 3,000 pound tree laid across the top. And the tree is clearly 40 feet long, if we take the view the whole length of it, 40 feet from one length to the other, and it's on top of the structure. So, again, why would a person haul this in there? And it didn't apparently fall. It's so huge that had it fallen on the structure, it would have just completely annihilated and blown the structure up. So it obviously had to be laid on top of there or set on top of there. I'd like anyone to tell me why anything would do that, but that's the way it is.
Yeah, it seems like they always have like very large and small just mixed together, and that's a prime example of that. Yeah, I don't think a human could move that without heavy equipment, really. Yeah,
and just inexplicable. And then, obviously, this is in a spot where there's been no heavy equipment. Utah's pretty dry. And when you bring, let's say, a backhoe or a tractor or something like that into an area like this, you're going to scar the ground, and it's going to be scarred for years. I mean, 10, 15 years. This isn't like the Northwest, where you can get moss and undergrowth that can cover something like that up in a couple of years. Utah is much too dry for that. So no big equipment came in here and moved these things around. This would have all had to be done by hand or by attaching a come-along at a tree.
Allow any heavy equipment in there, yeah.
Yeah, well, they wouldn't either. Yeah, well, you're in a Forest Service campground. You know, they're not going to pull this stuff off. And then why? They're going to spend this amount of money per hour for some guy just to build something so people wonder what he was doing? I mean, it makes no sense. Now, this next structure is another cabin-type structure, basically on the other side of the lake that we're at, up in Payson Canyon. And this was not found by me. This was shown to me by a researcher we both know, and Rex knows who that is. And do you want to tell a little more about this, Rex? I think you're as familiar with this structure as I am.
Well, I just know by the time I saw it, my understanding was that a large tree had gone down on this one, and this is how the other one would look if that large tree you saw kind of fell on it. It's my understanding before it was more orderly. Is that true? And I mean, is that...
Well, this is actually before.
Oh, okay.
This is actually before it got wiped out. Okay. So even though this looks like chaos, this is actually how this was built.
Okay.
And you can see this one in particular has these tall trees sticking up out of the middle of it here that are part of the structure that who knows why they're up there, pointed up in the air, and they're great big tall trees. Again, this is almost more triangular than it is rectangular in the way how it was built. Again, just chaos and craziness. The next picture down shows the side that's probably the most typical build of how a person would, in that you've got logs somewhat laid on top of each other. That goes up about 4.5 feet high on this side. And the next picture down, this shows the opposite side to that. And this shows the only entrance in to this little cabin type structure. Now this is interesting. This is only about 2.5 feet off the ground, from the base of the ground to the bottom of that pole going across the top there. So basically, for you or me or for a human to get into here, you'd have to get down on your belly and belly crawl into the inside of it. Now, would a human build a structure that's the only way that they could get inside of it? I don't think so. But again, this is the peculiarity of what you see in some of these Sasquatch structures. A person just wouldn't do that. That's just not how they do things. Now, this also has these upright poles again, and I don't know if I have another view, but you can see them lining this front entrance, how you have poles laid on top of each other, but then you'd have this collection of certain poles that are vertical and pointing up in the air. And here I've got a little better view showing those poles and how they're set there. And also this structure is on a hillside, and you could see maybe a little better in the previous photo, but the dirt was actually dug down to make it flat inside this structure, where it would have had a natural gradient had that not been dug away. And it's dug maybe 1.5 to 2 feet deep on the uphill side to, basically flush with the way the ground was on the downhill side.
Yeah, this one goes right down to the lake, so yeah, it's a hill leading up and down to that, if I remember right.
Yeah, and this structure is built in an area that's readily accessible to campers and to people if they knew where it was. And my guess is that when we came in, and I don't remember when it was exactly, but there was a huge tree that had been pushed on top of this and literally just exploded it to where it would destroy the entire structure. My feeling is that there are probably so many people going in here and looking at these Sasquatch creatures got tired of this and pushed this down to destroy it, saying, hey, leave us alone or leave this alone. That's my guess. I don't really know, but it just seemed kind of odd to me. Also, that previous cabin to the one we're talking about, I came back into that cabin the spring after I'd found it the previous fall, and there was another huge tree, not on the structure, but about 50 yards down the trail. It was across the trail. Enough that was a real obstacle to get across, so I had to walk way around it. And I know that Rio had spoken many times how he'd gone into areas and had trees and that moved into entrance areas, blocking his access or other people's access to get into an area once he'd found an area.
And I've even seen one Sasquatch area where it's a human camp, and they pulled out a big tree in front of the human camp so they couldn't easily camp there. So, yeah, it's commonly done to block trails and access.
And it's done enough that it just doesn't seem coincidental. I saw it once or twice a year, but just about every one of these sites, when people start visiting them, they're looking at them a fair amount, then the Sasquatches, I guess, do things to warn people away, and then will just destroy them when they abandon them and leave. I'm guessing that's what they do. Again, I don't really know how they think. All right, this is the end of this next folder, Rex. So we'll go to the third one here now. Okay, Rex, now, of everything I've ever seen, out in the woods, this structure we're looking at, this teepee structure that I first found in 2016, and this was over near an area that this researcher friend of ours, Rio, had shown us, and it was when we were walking out of there that we kind of walked into this, and he had not seen it before this time either, even though he looked at the surrounding area several times. This is fascinating, and this is a structure that, in my opinion, could not possibly have been built by humans. And if there's one thing in here that says this has got to prove the existence of a Sasquatch, it would be this structure. Now, the first thing you need to know about it is the immense size of this thing. That top of that teepee, the underneath is about 10 feet, to the, in essence, someone or something 10 feet tall could stand upright under the top of that and not touch their head on the logs. Second of all, the largest log you see that's basically going away and the second largest that starts off at our right and goes up to the left are enormous in weight. The one going away from us is larger in diameter than a telephone pole. It's got to be 1,000 to 1,500 pound log easily. And it's at least 40 feet long, the one going away from us. The large light structure that starts on the far right and goes up and out of the picture to the upper left, it probably weighs about the same, maybe a little less, but is clearly 60 feet long. Now, anybody that has a good understanding of physics realizes what kind of pressure or strength you would have to lift this up from the bottom, to have that enormous lever arm way, way out there and to lift that enormous weight. In fact, humans couldn't do it because you couldn't get enough humans underneath this thing that could hold those two logs up. So the answer to that is, okay, well then obviously what would have happened is they had to bring some heavy equipment in to do it. Now, no heavy equipment. This is a mile from a road. Again, this is Utah, dry. Those scars would be visible for years. No scarring of big equipment has been into this area whatsoever. The next explanation would be, well, somebody took a block and tackle, climbed up in a surrounding tree, and lifted these up. The problem with that is this is in a clearing. There are no trees up above this that you could have hooked a block and tackle to raise these trees up in the air. These trees had to be lifted from the bottom and that end put way up in the air and then somehow held in place, because these are all being held up by the force of each other weighed against another tree. There's not one nail, one bit of twine, one bit of rope tying this all together. These are all being forced together by the weight of one log pushing on another log. The engineering of this is ingenious. And I tell you, I would defy anybody to, first of all, tell me how they could have built it, and second of all, to build it. I don't think people could have built it under those parameters. You know, you couldn't use a block and tackle, you couldn't use heavy equipment, and you just had to have people with their hands in that lifting them from below. I don't think it's possible.
And what would you say to the people who just say this is natural deadfall or just fell like that because there's so much dead trees falling down? That's another one I've confronted with people who say that end of the thing.
Well, only people who are going to say that are people, first of all, haven't been out to see it, okay? And second, people that are looking for excuses, not to try to explain the obvious. A tree can't fall this way. First of all, some of these trees are over one tree, under another tree, over one tree, under another tree. They're interwoven. They're not just falling on top of each other. I would say, okay, come out and look at this and tell me how these could have fallen. How could one tree have fallen and have another tree on top of it that's actually holding the one up that's underneath it? That's how ingenious this cotton picking thing is. If you notice the big log going straight away, okay, it is being held up by the long tree starts at the right and goes up to the left. It's being held in place there because that tree's on topping it, pushing it down hard against that narrow little tree that comes up from the bottom left to the right, and it's pushing it down hard against that because there's a little crotch right there, okay, in there that the tree to the right is pushing on the large center tree. You're going to tell me those three things are going to all fall and somehow catch each other like that? No, it's impossible. And then the thing is this isn't going to be the only one. I mean, we're going to see a whole bunch of these. And to sit there and say, and then why are these only happening here? Why are they only happening with aspens? I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that just are way too improbable. Also, these logs across the bottom. In the foreground here, there's the great big long tree that goes across the bottom. Well, that is being used because that's holding in place some of these large trees to keep them from kicking out, okay, and falling down. So the fact you've got the weight of this holding that really long tree that starts in the middle and goes away from us in place so it can't be pushed out. Again, you've got things going on here that just could not possibly happen without some sort of engineering by an intelligent brain.
Yeah, just repeating again, this is another prime example of what I was saying earlier, the jigsaw puzzle type arrangement where everything's interlocking together to work simultaneously together, I guess you could say.
And like I said, this would take someone that really understood engineering, and then even still, it's not just the understanding of it, which we as humans can do. We can see how to do it.
And how to
but
implement
how
it.
do we do it?
Yep.
And we can't use a block and tackle. There's nothing to attach it to. And you can't use a crane to lift these things up. I mean, I tell you, it's anyway. So the next picture we've got